Imagine waking up one morning and being told that your country has been cut in half, not by a war you lost, not by a revolution from within, but by two foreign powers drawing a line on a map, a line that would separate families, define two entirely different futures, and within 5 years, trigger one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century. That is what happened to Korea. And the strangest part, the people who drew that line had almost no idea what they were doing. One of them later admitted he never even studied Korea before. They just grabbed an atlas and picked a latitude, the 38th parallel, a line that was never meant to be permanent, a line that still exists today. To understand why Korea split, you have to start with why it was vulnerable in the first place. Korea had been a unified civilization for over 1,000 years, a single language, a shared culture, one ruling dynasty. But by the late 19th century, Korea was caught between competing empires, China, Russia, and Japan, all pushing for influence on the peninsula. Japan won that contest. After defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. What followed was 35 years of colonial rule. The Korean language was suppressed, land was seized, Koreans were conscripted into Japanese labor and military service. The country was administered as a resource for Tokyo. Korean resistance never disappeared. Independence movements formed both inside Korea and in exile in China, in the Soviet Union, and even in the United States, but none of them had the military power to force Japan out. That would take a world war. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Korea's fate became tied to a much larger conflict. The Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, agreed in principle that Korea should eventually become independent. The Cairo Declaration of 1943 said Korea would be free in due course, vague words that would matter enormously later. But when Japan surrendered in August 1945, the question became urgent: who would actually take control of Korea in the meantime? Japan's surrender came faster than anyone expected. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. Japan announced it would surrender on August 15th. The war in the Pacific was over. The Soviet Union had entered the Pacific War just days earlier. On August 8th, Soviet troops were already moving into Manchuria and pushing toward Korea from the north. The United States had no troops anywhere near the peninsula. Washington needed a way to prevent the Soviets from occupying the entire country before American forces could arrive. Two U.S. Army colonels, working late at night in the Pentagon, were given 30 minutes to find a solution. They pulled out a National Geographic map of Korea and looked for a dividing line that made sense. The 38th parallel roughly split the country in half and kept Seoul, the capital, in the American zone. The Soviets accepted it. One of those colonels, Dean Rusk, who would later become Secretary of State, acknowledged that neither he nor his colleague had any expertise in Korean affairs. The line was practical, not political. It was never intended to be a national border. The plan was for the two zones to be administered temporarily, before Korea was reunified under a single government. That plan failed almost immediately. In the Soviet zone, the USSR installed a communist government led by Kim Il-sung, a Korean guerrilla fighter who had spent years in the Soviet Union and held the rank of major in the Red Army. In the American zone, the U.S. backed Syngman Rhee, a prince and educated Korean nationalist with deep anti-communist convictions and a long history of exile politics. Both men claimed to represent all of Korea. Neither was willing to share power. And as Cold War tensions between Washington and Moscow hardened in the late 1940s, the idea of a unified Korea became increasingly unrealistic. In 1948, two separate states were declared: the Republic of Korea in the south, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. The temporary line became a border, and both governments began building armies. The story didn't stop there. It got much worse. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with Soviet-supplied tanks in overwhelming numbers. The Korean War had begun. Within days, Seoul fell. Within weeks, South Korean and American forces had been pushed to a small corner of the southeast. The United States intervened under a United Nations mandate, and American-led forces pushed back hard. By October, they had not only retaken Seoul but were advancing deep into North Korea, approaching the Chinese border. China then entered the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops south. The front collapsed again. For 3 years, the peninsula became a killing field. Estimates vary, but millions of people died, soldiers and civilians on both sides. Cities were destroyed. Families were permanently separated as people fled in different directions across the shifting front line. The war ended not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice in July 1953. A ceasefire, not peace, just a pause in fighting. The border was now the demilitarized zone, running close to, but not exactly along, the old 38th parallel. Technically, the Korean War has never ended. What followed was a complete divergence. South Korea, with American support, rebuilt and industrialized. By the 1980s and 1990s, it had become one of Asia's most dynamic economies, a democracy after decades of authoritarian rule. Now a global leader in technology, manufacturing, and culture, North Korea went in the opposite direction. Under Kim Il sung and then his son Kim Jong il and grandson Kim Jong un, the country became one of the most isolated and repressive states on earth. A nuclear weapons program, widespread famine in the 1990s, a political system built on total control, two countries, one shared origin, utterly unrecognizable from each other. The division of Korea is one of the clearest examples of what happens when great power politics collides with the people who had no say in the outcome. A line drawn in 20 minutes by two men with a National Geographic map is still there today. It is one of the most heavily militarized borders on the planet, and on either side of it, nearly 80 million people live out the consequences of decisions made in 1945. There are still families divided by that border, people who haven't seen siblings, parents, or children in 7 decades. There is no mail across that line, no phone calls, no visits. What started as a temporary administrative arrangement became a geopolitical trap that no one has found a way out of. Reunification talks have come and gone. Summits have been held. Nothing has changed the fundamental reality. Korea didn't split because Koreans wanted it to. It split because the world's most powerful countries needed a quick solution at the end of one conflict, and didn't anticipate that it would plant the seeds of the next one. That is the story of a line that was never supposed to last, and somehow still does.